Tonight, you'll sleep behind a locked door, under a roof, at a temperature you can control with a switch on the wall. If it drops below freezing outside, you probably won't even notice until you check your phone. That comfort is so automatic you never have to think about it. But for most of human history, none of that existed. No walls. No roof. No thermostat. Just open ground, open sky, and whatever the night decided to throw at you. So how did a hairless, slow, physically unremarkable primate survive millions of nights outdoors, in ice ages, deserts, and storms, with nothing built to protect it? The first answer is the one people usually skip past. Humans found shelter before they built it. Caves, rock overhangs, dense thickets. Long before anyone constructed anything, our ancestors were opportunists, taking advantage of whatever the landscape already offered. Sites like the caves at Wonderwerk in South Africa show evidence of hominins using natural shelter and controlled fire together as far back as 1 million years ago. That combination, a windbreak plus fire, solved the two biggest problems at once. Fire kept predators at a distance and kept the air around a sleeping group warm enough to survive. But you can't always find a convenient cave exactly when you need one, especially if you're following migrating animals across open, treeless plains. And that's where things get genuinely impressive. In Ukraine, at a site called Mezhirich, archaeologists uncovered something that looks almost unbelievable at first glance. Around 15,000 years ago, people living on a treeless, freezing steppe, with essentially no wood for building, built houses out of mammoth bones. Skulls stacked to form a base, tusks curved and interlocked to form an arched frame, the whole structure likely covered in hides for insulation. Researchers have identified the remains of dozens of mammoths used in a single dwelling. This wasn't a shelter of convenience. It was engineering, using the largest available resource on a landscape that offered almost nothing else to build with. Further back, at a site in southern France called Terra Amata, archaeologist Henry de Lumley uncovered evidence that hominins were building deliberate shelters as early as 400,000 years ago, oval structures made from branches, weighted down with stones, with a central hearth position to keep the whole space warm. That's not survival by luck. That's planning ahead for a specific, predictable problem, the fact that the temperature was about to drop and someone needed a plan for it before the sun went down. And when a group didn't have a hut or a bone structure, they had each other. Body heat is a real, measurable resource, and a body sleeping alone in the cold loses far more heat than a body sleeping in a tight group. Multiple people sleeping close together, sometimes literally piled on top of each other, could raise the effective temperature of the sleeping space by several degrees just through shared warmth. It's a strategy that costs nothing and requires no tools at all, just proximity, and it's probably one of the oldest shelter technologies humans ever used. Here's something people rarely think about, though. Some of the shelter wasn't behavioral at all. It was already built into the body. Humans lost most of our body hair somewhere between 1 and 3 million years ago, likely to help us cool down while running and hunting in the heat of the African savanna. That trade-off left us more exposed to cold once our ancestors started moving into colder climates, which is exactly why fire, clothing, and shelter had to evolve alongside that hair loss rather than after it. Losing our fur and figuring out how to replace its function weren't two separate events. They were the same story, told from two different angles. Think about that trade for a second. Evolution solved overheating by making us more vulnerable to cold, and then trusted our brains to invent the fix. That's a strange kind of bet to make on a species, and somehow it paid off. There's also a slower biological form of shelter that most people never consider: cold tolerance itself. Populations that lived for generations in genuinely harsh climates, from the Arctic to the high Andes, show measurable physiological differences in how their bodies generate and retain heat, including differences in a tissue called brown fat, which burns energy specifically to produce warmth rather than to power movement. Shelter wasn't only something ancient humans built around themselves. In some populations, over enough generations, it became something partly built into them. It's worth sitting with how narrow the margin actually was. One bad storm without a fire lit in time, one collapsed shelter during a cold snap, one group too small to share enough body heat through the night, and that was often the difference between a family that made it to spring and one that didn't. There was no backup plan. The shelter you built, or found, or huddled inside of, usually had to work on the first try. So here's the full picture. 1 million years ago, it was a cave mouth and a fire. 400,000 years ago, it was a deliberately built hut with a hearth at the center. 15,000 years ago, on a landscape with no trees at all, it was a house built from the bones of the largest animal on the continent. And underneath all of that, the whole time, it was bodies packed together for warmth and a species slowly reshaping its own biology to survive nights it was never physically built to survive. You'll never build a shelter out of mammoth bones. You'll probably never need to sleep in a pile of strangers just to make it to morning. But that instinct to find warmth, to build a barrier between yourself and the cold, to seek out other people when the night gets difficult, that part never actually left. It's just wearing a much better roof now.